During the first half of the 1970s, few bands within the downtown New York rock scene considered themselves punk. It was a word that artists would have recognized in music magazines that they read, but not a term yet associated with New York rock. There were exceptions, of course. In 1971, Brooklyn-based electronic rock duo Suicide billed their shows as punk music, but by and large, punk pertained to the world outside of New York. Instead, glitter, glam, trash, street, even drag rock were more common descriptors of the scene. These terms appeared in billings, reviews, and published interviews. We called our scene street rock back then, recalled Hilly Crystal, the operator of CBGB's. The term was synonymous with trash rock, which itself overlapped with glam and glitter, but still was evocative of the economic and social contexts of 1970s New York. It was the aftermath of the 60s, Hilly recalled, a deep recession where everyone had $60 apartments and lived on food stamps. That's why everyone wore cheap jeans and t-shirts. But that association changed in 1975. The concept of punk magazine came together through the collaboration of high school friends John Holmstrom, Ged Dunn, and Eddie Legs McNeil. The three moved to New York City from the suburbs of Connecticut in the early 1970s and immediately began sketching plans to publish an independent zine associated with the local rock scene. John Holmstrom was the cartoonist of the group. He drew influences from the countercultural illustrations like R. Crumb, while Ged Dunn assumed the responsibility for the business end of things. McNeil saw himself as a music journalist. Holmstrom, Dunn, and McNeil initially considered the name Teenage News, a reference to an unreleased New York Dolls track, which is indicative of how deeply influential the Dolls were among bands in 1970s New York. Instead, they settled on punk, a term they derived from punk rock, which by 1975 had crept into music journalism as a descriptor for new sounds in the rock world. In advance of their premiere issue, Holmstrom and McNeil plastered the city with posters to build buzz for their new magazine. The posters were simple, emblazoned with bold lettering. Watch out, punk is coming. I am Ryan Purcell, and this is Soundscapes. Okay. Soundscapes NYC is a bi-monthly podcast about the sounds of the 70s that shaped New York City history. In the last episode, I talked with British music journalist John Savage about the curious roots of the word punk rock. It was a wide-ranging conversation about groups like the Buzzcocks, Jane County, the New York Dolls, and about the meaning of punk in history. In this episode, I talked with cartoonist John Holmstrom, the co-founder of Punk Magazine. In the early 1970s, John Holmstrom moved to New York City to attend the School for Visual Arts. Along with McNeil and Dunn, Holmstrom founded Punk as an independently produced magazine focused on the New York rock scene. The magazine ran from 1976 to 1979, publishing 15 visually rich issues during that period. In addition to publishing Punk Magazine, Holmstrom illustrated numerous covers of punk albums, like the Ramones' Rocket to Russia and Road to Ruin. Holmstrom's work and unmistakable artistic style has become the key visual representation of the punk era, and indeed a consequential era in the history of New York City. And today, Holmstrom wants to remind us that punk is not dead. In September 2024, Holmstrom relaunched Punk Magazine, celebrating the release with a Battle of the Bands contest in Tompkins Square Park. It was a phenomenal event marking a new chapter in the history of Punk Magazine. The following interview was recorded in the summer of 2024. Throughout the conversation, Holmstrom references the relaunched Punk Magazine, which took place on September 28th, 2024, and coincided with the premiere of the Soundscapes NYC podcast. And here's that conversation now. John Holmstrom, welcome to Soundscapes NYC. I'm so happy to have you on this show. Very delighted to talk with you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Great to hear. I saw recently on the Punk Magazine webpage, there was recently a screening of the Ramones' their first gig at CBGB's in 1974.
We did a screening of End of the Century out in Queens to commemorate the first show the Ramones, all four Ramones did together at CBGB on August 16th, 1974. So after the film, I interviewed the directors, the co-directors, Jim Fields, Michael Gramaglia, and then we brought on some of the Tangerine Puppets, who were in an early band with Johnny and Tommy, and we had Monty Melnick, who was in a band with Tommy called Butch, and Mickey Lee, who was in a few bands with some of the guys, and of course he's Joey's brother, so they made music together all the time. And a guy named Noel Citron, who was a very good friend of Joey's, and they had told some pretty funny stories about the good old days.
I'm reminded of a great memoir by Joey Ramone's brother, Mickey Lee, with an evocative title, I Slept with Joey Ramone, a family memoir, Simon & Schuster, 2009. But I'm really interested in your story, your engagement with New York City during the 1970s and what you experienced. And in previous interviews that you've done, you talk a lot about growing up in the Connecticut suburbs in the 1960s, and you discuss the kind of impressions that people in your neighborhood in the suburbs in Connecticut got during that time from New York City. You talk about it as a place, garbage strikes, newspaper strikes, all kinds of strikes going on. And I'm wondering, like, okay, what brings you to New York City at this time? You're seeing all these negative kind of perceptions of what's going on in New York City. What's attracting you to New York City at this time?
Well, I visited here in 1969, New Year's Eve, to see Jimi Hendrix at the Fillmore East. And it was like being in the perfect world. There were underground comic books being sold on St. Mark's Place and all kinds of great books, record stores. There were big crowds of young people all over the place, great restaurants. So I was like, wow, I'd love to live in New York. And now I live just a few blocks away from where the Fillmore East used to be.
Oh, that's fantastic. So a lot has changed since the 70s. Would you still say it's still a center for ideas and things that you found in the 70s, or has it changed a lot?
Oh, it's changed a lot. It still is. There's still a lot of culture here, but unfortunately, I think that our history kind of gets in the way. Like everybody wants to come here to see the CBGB scene, and that left a long time ago. Also, it's become a city of the rich. And when I lived here in the 60s and 70s, well, I lived here in the 70s, it was a city of the East Village was really all poor people. But that's what we loved about it. You can get a cheap rent. I moved into my current apartment back in 77 when the rent was $120 a month.
And you were able to stay there?
Yeah, I've been here ever since.
Wow.
But we all had cheap rents back then, and that's what allowed us to pursue our creative goals. We didn't have to get a full-time job just to pay the rent.
Right.
You could get a gig. Like I was doing a comic strip for a magazine that was paying $300 a page. So that would take me a few days, and I had the rest of the month to put out a fanzine called Punk. So that likewise with the bands, you could live cheap and spend a lot of time on your craft.
This is something that I'm hearing from a lot of other people. There's the cost of living is so much less than it is today. Like you said, a city of the rich. It's how it's transformed in some ways. Going back to 1972, so you first traveled to New York City in 1969. But in 1972, you enrolled at the School of Visual Arts. Is that the right year, 72?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're studying illustration, or what are you studying at SVA?
Well, at the School of Visual Arts, they had a program. I don't know if they still have it, but the first year is called the Foundation, and it was all painting and drawing and art, fine art. You didn't get to take the fun stuff until the second year, and that's when we approached the school because they didn't have any classes that taught comics. And a lot of us went there because some very famous cartoonists and comic book artists went to the school in the past. So the president said, we got enough people to enroll. And the president said, just tell us who to hire and we'll try to get them on board. So we had Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman at the top of the list. They both said yes. So I ended up learning from the two top people in comics. And then the great thing about School of Visual Arts, they don't hire teachers, they hire working artists. So I had to drop out of school, and then both Will and Harvey hired me and found work for me and got my start in the business. I really owe everything to those guys.
What kind of work are you doing as an assistant, a personal assistant? You're paid part-time, paid only a minimum wage. Yep. What kind of stuff are they having you doing?
Yeah, it was like a glorified internship. Harvey hired me to do some freelance stuff. He tried me out on an Annie Fanny where I would have to put his tracing paper drawings onto artboard, but I don't think I passed the test. He got me a job at Crept magazine, a humor magazine. They had me do some gags. It was not a funny strip, and I don't think it ever ran, but I got paid. He hired me to do some lettering. He was going to work on newspaper called the Funny Papers, and they were going to run European comics. So I did the word balloons for the translations into English. He was always a big supporter of French and European comics, where comics are considered more of an art form. Especially back then, comics were considered trash, which is what I liked about him. So, and Will, I was an apprentice, so he had me sweeping the floors and putting together packages for selling book ideas to places. So I learned about how to prepare a package professionally for submission to a publishing company and how to do a book proposal. So it was a very interesting job.
You're really learning from the masters of the craft at that time, Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman. And I'm thinking about how you've gone on and used your craft in illustration and comic book making, illustrating covers, for example, for the Ramones, Rocket to Russia and Road to Ruin. From your perspective, what is the relationship between comics and punk rock? Is there a relationship between comics and punk rock? Is it?
I always had this theory that comics and rock and roll had a symbiotic relationship. Like rock and roll was born in the 50s, and that's when EC Comics became popular. And juvenile delinquency was a big problem. Well, they were blaming juvenile delinquency on comic books and rock and roll. And then you go forward to the early 60s, and you had the Fantastic Four and the Fab Four. You have Marvel Comics and the Beatles and the Stones and the British Invasion. Then go a few more years, and you got psychedelic rock, and you had underground comic books. So I picked up that with this punk rock thing happening, there should be like a new kind of magazine, a comics magazine. So I want to do a hybrid rock magazine comic book. I figured I would get the best of both worlds. But instead, we were too much of a comic book for rock magazine people and too much of a rock magazine for comic book people. But we ended up finding our own audience.
And just to clarify, you're doing this all on your off time between your jobs for Eisner and Kurtzman. Is that correct?
No, I had left working for Will.
Okay.
In fact, he was moving his office to Florida at the time. He was kind of closing down his operation on Park Avenue South. So he ended up loaning me some of his office furniture. So we had his great big oak desk in the punk dump. You know, you'd have this really nice desk in this crappy storefront that's falling apart, full of roaches and mice and stuff. So that was really nice of him. And I had enough work because I was doing work for a magazine called Bananas, where I was working with this guy. My editor was Jovial Bob Stein, who turned to the dark side after Bananas went out of business in the 80s, and he became R.L. Stein of
Wow,
Goosebumps.
that's incredible.
So yeah, I've been very lucky in finding people to work with. But that was paying the rent and giving me the time I needed to work on the fanzine, and my friend Ged Dunn put up a couple $1,000. So when we did punk, I was full-time devoted to putting it out. The publisher was kind of lazy, and Lick McNeil did virtually nothing but get drunk and pick up girls. So, but I was really happy I got to put out a magazine.
It's a creative endeavor, and it's yours. It has your name in it. You're a part of the founding editorship of this magazine, and that we're still talking about it today. So in this podcast, this show, I'm really focused on the relationship between the music and the space. But what the story about the punk magazine shows is that it's more than the music. That punk culture is more than music. It's about print media, as your magazine shows. It's about fashion. It's about language. It's about all these different things. It's about attitude. What with space? Can you tell a little bit of the story about punk magazine offices?
Yeah.
How did you find this space? What was it before? You talked a little bit about the furniture. Could you paint a picture about the punk dump, about the origins of the punk dump?
Yeah, sure. I gave my notice to my roommate. I was living in Brooklyn with a Grateful Dead head. Couldn't wait to get out of there. And I was looking everywhere for a cheap office. I couldn't find anything anywhere, and the roommate was freaking out. I only had a couple days left before I had to move out of his apartment. He had a new roommate coming in. And then I just happened to find this listing in the Village Voice for a storefront over on 10th Avenue and 30th Street, which is now where the Hudson Yards project, the biggest real estate project in the history of New York City, is now located there. The building is long gone, but it was perfect. It was pretty big, and they had desks and chairs and file cabinets and a big shipping table. Basically, everything we needed to start a business was there. And the real estate guys showing it off and saying, well, we can throw away all this old furniture. I'm like, no, keep it. We'll take it. I mean, it was only $195 a month, but we were out in the middle of nowhere by the was it the Hudson Tunnel over on 30th and 10th?
I guess Lincoln Tunnel then.
No, Lincoln. Okay, yeah, the Hudson's downtown. I don't drive, so I don't keep track of these
It's a
things.
different way experiencing the city. Definitely driving.
Yeah, but back then it was like high crime area. There weren't any stores around. Geez, I wonder how we got through that thing. But it was perfect for us. All you needed was a phone and a Con Ed account for the electric, and we're good to go. We didn't have a bathroom. You know, we had a water closet, but no bath or shower. That was the toughest thing.
Okay, so you had to be a bit resourceful in terms of that kind of situation.
Yeah.
And about what time is this? Is this 75 or is it earlier than
We
that?
moved in November 1st, actually Halloween night, 75. Then by Thanksgiving weekend, we were at CBGB's interviewing the Ramones and Lou Reed.
So you were hitting the ground running. You knew what you wanted to do. You had now the office, and you're like, let's go create content. Let's go interview people. Let's create the first issue.
Yeah, well, it took a few weeks to get more furniture. We needed a couch, and Ged wanted to build a loft for his bed. So it took a couple of weeks. But yeah, we did the interviews on Thanksgiving weekend, did a couple photo shoots, and got the magazine off to the printer before Christmas. And then New Year's Eve, it was rolling off the press.
Just as a quick aside, listeners can access the entire Punk magazine collection, which is housed in the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center. Make an appointment with the archivist, and they will introduce you to a world of sound and vision. I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the issues from 1977, the summer 1977, a little bit later. But before we get there, I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the club CBGB. And I'm specifically interested in about the space of the club. Could you talk about like a typical night going out to CBGB? Like talk about the exterior. Were there any clubs nearby? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, it was as the movie shows, CBGB was below a SRO hotel, which was basically where bums would stay. So you'd have a lot of bums hanging out, especially during the spring, summer, and fall. So when you'd hang out at CBGB's, often you'd be hanging out in the sidewalk outside the club. And so you'd be hanging out with bums and hipsters, scenesters, whatever you want to call them. And you'd walk in. It was a very long, narrow club. It was very long and not that wide. Had a very long bar. So first thing you do is stop by the reception desk where Roberta Bailey would usually be running the door. And, you know, I'd talk to her for a bit, then go inside, get a drink. If you like the band, if you're there to see the band, you go to the back of the club to hang out by the stage. If you didn't like the band, you just hang out by the front of the club and talk to your friends and hang out and drink. You know, it was unusual because it was like usually you go to see a show, you know, you're showing your seat. It's like going to the movies and you don't really hang out. You just sit there and watch and then leave. But this was like watching a band in somebody's living room, you know? Everybody always says Hilly was like your cool uncle who'd let you do whatever you want to do in the basement.
So it was Hilly's direction of the club that made it so comfortable? Is it what you're talking about?
Well, I think it was his thrift. You know, he was very cheap. It was kind of hard to make money with a Bowery bar where your clientele are all bums or Hell's Angels. So it had that feeling of being an old Bowery bar. Like before the punks took over and put stickers and flyers all over everything, there was a painting of a racetrack and there were giant photos of vaudeville stars. And it just had the ambiance of really being in an old Bowery saloon. And in fact, when Luke Sante, for the never seen documentary about CBGBs that Seymour Stein's daughter Mandy made, they excavated the club after they were tearing it down, and they discovered that part of the bar actually did date back to the 19th century. So it had that feeling like very old New York. But it also, like in the front, there's a couch, there was a bookshelf with old books in it, and there was a chair. You really felt like you were in the living room or something, you know? You felt like you were in a home and not in a business.
Sounds like such a comfortable environment, especially to see new and emerging artists do their craft, perform their craft, almost like a more intimate kind of setting than if you were to go like for the Fillmore East or to a more traditional kind of theater to see a show. And you mentioned the film CBGB, directed by Randall Miller, released in 2013 and starring the late, great Alan Rickman as Hilly Crystal. Also want to mention that listeners can stream this film on Amazon Prime Video. And I thought that would be great to talk about that that film as it relates to your story and as it relates to the story of Punk magazine. What was your involvement with this scene? Involvement with the film, I should say.
Sure. They contacted me early on, and we met at a couple restaurants, and I showed them the magazine and told them the story of, going to CBGB's and interviewing Lou Reed and how the magazine kind of took off and put the P word on the map. And they were very receptive. There was a husband and wife writer-director team, Randall Miller and Jody Savin, and they're very nice. And they really included me in many aspects of the film. I ended up doing some animations for it. I was a character. They tried to give me a cameo, but I ended up on the cutting room floor. The way Cheetah Chrome is in it, he's the cab driver briefly. But yeah, it was great. They brought me out to a screening in California where a focus group discussed the film. And 20 people were in the focus group. And Randy asked the crowd, like, who liked the film? Put up your hand. And 20 hands went up, and the scores were very high. Not real extremely high, but it seemed like the movie would be popular. So I had a great time. They brought me down to Savannah, Georgia, where they filmed everything in this old butcher facility. They reconstructed CBGB's. They actually had part of the original bar and the original phone booth and the original jukebox and all this stuff. And I'm standing there at one point, and I see Hilly over there, being played by Alan Rickman, and I see Debbie Harry, and I really felt like I was time traveling for a bit. I saw the scenes where Blondie performed on stage and the Ramones played on stage. I thought they did a really good job of telling the real story of CBGB's, which I think it was more funny than tragic. I think people were expecting more drama and more darkness instead of a light comedy.
The story of CBGB's, as I saw it from that film, seemed to just be like this club that comes out of happenstance. Hilly needed a venue to create money. So he gets a loan, I think it's from his mother, right? And creates this. It's a vehicle for him to sustain himself, but also to pursue his creative endeavors and managing a band and being involved with arts and music specifically. I loved it. And I was also thinking about the comic panel style of the film, how the scenes are progressed through this comic illustration, and it reminded me of the Warriors from the 70s, that film. And I was wondering, so you did some animations with that design as well?
I didn't do the animations, but I did the drawings that they had animated. Yeah, they just did kind of a squiggly thing with most of the they didn't do a lot of full animation. They wanted some drawings, so they'd send me the stills, so I would take the stills and kind of trace over them and draw in my style. But it was really tricky, because if I had to do, was it Taylor Hawkins played Iggy, but am I drawing Iggy or am I drawing Taylor? That was really tough to kind of blend those two images. Am I drawing Stib Bators or am I drawing this guy who's playing Stib Bators? It was rough, and you're always on a deadline. Like, while I was working on the drawings for the movie, Hurricane Sandy happened, and I didn't have power for almost a week. And the director was freaking out. They wanted to send like a search party for me because I was incommunicado. No phone, no TV, no nothing. So this stuff always happens around punk rock. There's always some like thing that happens that ruins everything,
Right. It sounds like a riveting story in and of itself, the making of this film. I love the film. I thought it was great. I mean, it provided like a little snapshot of what life was like in relationship to the so-called punk scene, the rock scene, that really seems to get its name from your magazine, which I think is brilliant. You're really a core part of the story. What parts of this film does not accurately represent your story? How does it deviate? Or is it completely as it was seen in the film?
The only part I might have had a problem with, I warned the filmmakers about putting Iggy on stage at CBGB's because he never performed there, but that was creative license. They used Iggy as like that was kind of a dream sequence, but also the ending was kind of weird, because what really happened was all that bad stuff did happen with the Dead Boys, and they broke up, and Hilly lost a lot of money kind of betting on the wrong horse. I mean, you look at Hilly, and he managed two bands, the Shirts and the Dead Boys, while he had Blondie and the Ramones and all these bands playing there that he could have picked up on. They tried to put out a record called Live at CBGB's with some of these other bands, but I don't know how it did. So, but Hilly clamped down, and there was no more guest list privileges. I would have to pay to get in. They constructed these weird wooden bars all over the place, I guess as a form of crowd control or something. And it suddenly wasn't very comfortable. And that That's when the new wave disco thing was happening in 79. So you had the Mud Club opening up, and you had Hurrah, and you had all these other clubs playing new wave and punk rock. So they kind of try to make it a happy ending, but they had to cut the story off somewhere. But the real story is that CBGB became more of a mecca for punk rock when the hardcore matinees were happening, and all those kids were starting bands. You had all these teenage bands in New York and all over the country. It was a pretty wild time, the 80s. The whole evolution of punk rock to me is more interesting than what we did in the beginning. Because, how do we get to 50 years and we still have punk rock? I don't get it. I thought punk died, right?
I'm so glad you brought up Sant. She might go by Lucy Sant now, but I had Lucy Sant on the show, and Sant was saying that a lot of people think that punk rock started in New York City, that then flowered in different places and then came back to New York. But Sant has an interesting perspective on things, because she's saying it's the germination of the scene that then flowers in different places, but nonetheless is still quite important for New York in the 70s.
Well, I would disagree with that, because it was happening all over the world. People say, oh, well, it started in London or it started in New York. Well, what about the Saints?
Right.
They're from Australia. They brought out Stranded. It was single of the year in 76. You had Radio Birdman in Australia. The Sex Pistols actually started in November 75, the same time we started the magazine. So they call it proto-punk, which I hate, because I considered MC5, New York Dolls, all these bands punk rock. Alice Cooper. I was a huge fan of Alice Cooper. I always thought of that album Killer as a punk rock album. But by 75, all that stuff fell apart. The whole glam punk thing was dead. And that's where I saw an opportunity to kind of relaunch the music with bands like the Dictators and the Ramones. But for whatever reason, a band like Richard Hell and the Voidoids, which weren't your classic punk rock group, the New York scene was a lot more varied. I think even the Sex Pistols said once, when it came to punk rock, they thought 1,000 flowers should bloom, but not 1,000 flowers that sound exactly like the Sex Pistols. Susie and the Banshees are a good example of a London punk band that was not your typical punk rock, The Talking Heads were kind of punk in the beginning, because they were covering Bubblegum and doing songs like Psycho Killer, and it was a three-piece group. It was very minimalist. That was the word we used in 76, minimal, and that's where we were picking up on something from the art scene. And that's where I think the New York scene was strongest. The CBGB scene wasn't just about music. When you look at the filmmakers who emerged from it, and the writers, and the fashion scene, all the different facets of a culture that came together there. It was even stronger than any other music scene when you compare it to Swinging London or the San Francisco psychedelic scene or the grunge scene. I really feel that New York had the most creative scene of all of them, and we produced the most talent in many different fields.
I think that's what's so great about this story in New York during that period. And the story of Punk Magazine, your story, embodies the fact that punk culture encompasses all of these different things: print media, fashion, even to some extent, an attitude, a way of looking at the world.
Okay, now let's step back and explore the soundscape that we're illustrating. Holmstrom's Punk Magazine offered a visual parallel to the gritty and raw rhythms that he heard from bands at CBGB. For example, here's Richard Hell and the Voidoids, Blank Generation, released by Sire Records in 1977.
I was saying let me out of here before I was even born. It's such a gamble when you get a face. It's fascinating to observe what the mirror does, but when I died it's for the wall that I've set a place. I belong to the blank generation, and I can take it or leave it each time. Well, I belong to the generation, but I can take it or leave it each time.
Now from that same album, here's a track called Down at the Rock and Roll Club, a track which narrates a typical night at CBGB's, driven by a hard rock rhythm and an aggressive vocal style.
Are you gonna go out tonight? Well, I am uncertain, I ain't feeling too right. But I rip up my shirt, watch the Mary Bird. Yeah, I'm going out in the sight. Yo! Scotch and soda! Whoa!
And finally, to add fuel to that fire, here's another band heavily featured in the pages of Punk Magazine, the Dead Boys, All This and More, off of their debut album, Young, Loud, and Snotty, again by Sire Records, 1977.
All this and more.
Now, let's get back to our conversation. So, getting back to Punk Magazine, I want to talk about a specific issue that came out in the summer of 1977, and that is Liz Kurtzman's Punk Cutout page.
Yeah.
Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
No, not at all. But Liz Kurtzman was Harvey's daughter. She was with us from the beginning. We became good friends. Harvey would have me up for dinner now and then. Like Thanksgiving, before I went to CBGB, I had Thanksgiving dinner at Kurtzman's, at Harvey Kurtzman's. And the other guest was Art Crumb.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's my hero. That's my idol. So it was kind of like a dress rehearsal, because then by the time I meet Lou Reed, it's like, oh, okay, this guy, I know him. I couldn't be intimidated meeting anybody after meeting Art Crumb. So Liz didn't do a lot for us after a while. She was going to be the fashion editor, but we didn't really have that kind of edge. But one day she just came up with this thing with the punk cutout page where you could take paper dolls and put different punk outfits on them. And it was a very popular feature. We always did that stuff best. That was the best thing about punk. It wasn't like our music coverage. It was the humor or our reviews of food or some weird thing we would do, a photo comic strip.
Very surprised to know and delighted to know that Liz Kurtzman is Harvey Kurtzman's daughter and is a part of this as well. I love this 2-page illustration in some ways because it kind of identifies aspects of punk fashion in some ways. For example, like the leather jacket, that's so iconic to punk fashion and punk culture, or the zippers on the pants for the man side of things. What about, for example, the stiletto knife, right? What about the stiletto knife? How is that punk?
Oh, well, if you grew up in the 50s, the whole part of the juvenile delinquent movement, whatever you wanted to call it, the scariest thing was the switchblade knife. You know, like I think it's in the movie Blackboard Jungle with my other hero, Vic Morrow, playing a punk, and he pulls a switchblade out in the teacher. And there's a fight in the classroom. You know, I mean, the switchblade was kind of a symbol of the danger of these kids in leather jackets. You know, they're going to pull out a knife and slash your throat.
Yeah.
So it was like a cliche.
I totally get that. And it also makes sense in terms of like you group that in with comic book culture from that time and, the motorcycle jackets along with that. It's giving me this image of youth culture in America during the 1950s. And you can hear that sonically too, with the bands referencing those bands from the 70s, referencing those bands from the late 50s and early 60s, the girl group bands, and to some extent the rockabilly bands from the 50s. And that totally makes sense. What about the Nazi iconography, like the swastika? Like, how does that become part of punk culture, or at least as it's represented in the magazine?
Yeah, well, I always figured there were two warring cultures in a way in the 60s. You had the biker culture, and then you had the hippie culture. The hippies were about love beads and flowers, and the bikers would be wearing iron crosses and leather jackets and helmets, and they wear swastikas. My father was a veteran, so growing up, I would have Nazi memorabilia all over the house. You know, you had a breastplate and an armband and a knife and a Luger. I mean, we won. So when we used the swastika, to me it was like we can make fun of him. You know, my father was a POW in World War II. His favorite TV show was Hogan's Heroes. There are certain people who were appalled that Hogan's Heroes was making fun of our prisoners of war. But our POWs had a good sense of humor. You know, they could take a joke. So that's how we felt about the swastika. The swastika's a joke. There aren't Nazis anymore. Hitler's dead. I don't understand why it still has this weird scare thing to it. Because I don't see neo-Nazis around here, you know. I know there's people who still believe in that stupid stuff, but I thought we were making fun of it and not promoting it.
You mentioned also something really interesting about the biker gangs. I mean, from what I know, the Hells Angels also employ these symbols as well, perhaps just as a kind of shock mechanism that on their jackets, or at least from the movie that we saw, Hells Angels are very much part of that origin of that club as well, often frequented in the early years of the CBGBs. Yeah, so maybe part of that is coming from the biker gangs as well.
Oh, absolutely. In the 70s, we were trying to offend people. We were pushing the limits. We had magazines like Screw and Hustler and National Lampoon, and the humor would often be so offensive, it would surprise people today to see it. They wouldn't believe that you were allowed to publish this kind of material. But in fact, that's supposed to be what the First Amendment gives us protection for, is saying whatever we want and then letting, hopefully people are intelligent enough to figure out what's good and what's bad.
Punkmagazine.com. That's your magazine. That's your website, right?
Yeah.
Would you like to talk about new things that are coming out on the website or new events that you might be doing?
Yeah, I'm trying to update the website and relaunch the magazine. We have plans to bring out an issue the end of September, and we're going to do a concert in Tompkins Square Park with 6 punk bands and have kind of a battle of the bands and see if we have a winner. I'm working on all this right now. I don't know when the podcast is going to broadcast, but hopefully we'll have a lot of information out there now. We're starting to send out the messages now about all this stuff happening. I mean, people keep telling me there's a big punk revival happening. There's all these great punk bands out there. So I figure, like, I'll help it develop. You know, we can help some of these young emerging punk bands to get some attention. And all anybody remembers about the punk rock is what happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But we need the culture to keep going. We need it to come back to life.
Yeah, totally. I'm aware of some great things happening in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and Ridgewood, Queens, places like TVI and the Broadway. There are great sounds out there, like the Josephine Network, Malavista, Cold Dice, just to name a few. We just need to tune our ears to what's going on today. And it may not be in the East Village anymore. Despite its narrow focus, Punk Magazine brought national attention to the New York rock scene during the 1970s. And I think it's so great that in 2024, you're relaunching Punk Magazine to promote bands today.
What was that club you talked, TBI?
TVI.
Oh, TVI. Yeah, I've heard of that place. And then I read somewhere today, a place called St. Vitus got closed down, but it sounded like it might have been more of a metal bar.
St. Vitus is down, yeah, unfortunately. But it seems that there is a pulse to New York rock and roll, and that pulse is quickening, if ever so slightly. And I hope it continues.
Yeah, well, it comes in waves. It's up and down. Because in the early 2000s, I felt like there was a thriving scene at CBGB's again. I really liked a band called the Bullies. We had both the Continental and CBGB's open. Coney Island High was still around for a while. And Manhattan had a decent club scene that really took root in the 80s and lasted into the 90s until Giuliani started closing everything down. But I guess now everything's happening in Brooklyn. So it's tough to keep tabs on it from way over here in Manhattan.
Totally. And when you're talking about the early 2000s, I'm thinking about like the New York Dolls, I think, reformed and put out an album at that time too. It sounds like that was a big kind of uptick in New York rock.
Yeah, that's when Blondie reformed. And before you know it, all these punk bands started doing reunions, and they're still going on. I mean, the Dictators and the Damned just played the Hammerstein Ballroom a few months ago. I've heard there's pretty big crowds for these bands too.
Yeah, totally. John, I don't have any more questions for you. I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. And I'm so excited to see the reformation and the republication of a Punk Magazine. I think it's a vital source of information and also a vital forum to promote new emerging bands. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks, Ryan. Been nice chatting with you.
So hopefully we can stay in touch and perhaps collaborate again.
Great.
All right. I'll see you later. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
That was my conversation with artist John Holmstrom. I hope it was as fun to listen to as it was to record. In the next episode, we further define the parameters of punk rock as it pertained to 1970s New York. I talk with Melissa Ziobro, curator of the Bruce Springsteen Archives and Center for American Music at Monmouth University, and Jim Cullen, author of Born in the USA, Bruce Springsteen in American Life by Rutgers University Press. The fundamental question in this next episode is, what was Bruce Springsteen's engagement with punk rock? In 1979, Springsteen famously wrote the song Hungry Heart for the Ramones, which he then released on one of his most famous albums, The River, released by Columbia Records in 1980. Springsteen also co-wrote songs with Patti Smith, the purported godmother of punk rock. Songs like Because the Night, which appeared on her Easter album, released by Arista Records in 1977. During the 1970s, Springsteen performed in punk venues and often sported the punk look, including the black leather jacket, blue jeans, and t-shirt. But still, Springsteen was distinct from the New York punk scene. It is a fantastic conversation. I am so excited to share it with you. I want to give a few shout outs to Will Riley for providing the theme song for today's episode, to the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate Center in Manhattan for presenting the show, Thank you for the generous support of the Urban History Association. An in-depth feature on Soundscapes NYC will be published on the Metropole, the official blog of the Urban History Association. I am so grateful for their support. I also want to thank Sarah Lawrence College, where I teach American Studies, and to my production assistant, Ava Castro de Verona. And finally, I want to thank you for tuning in. I have 4 more exciting conversations to share with you in this first season of Soundscapes NYC, and I'm putting together plans for a second season on disco and New York City history. That season is scheduled to premiere in the spring of 2025. You can stay up to date with what's going on the podcast by following our socials. For Instagram, that's at Soundscapes NYC. Again, that's at Soundscapes NYC. Your engagement goes a long way. Because of your support, Soundscapes NYC is growing, and I'm excited to see where this journey takes us. Until next time, I'm Ryan Purcell.
I need to argue.